Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a video on this Sagan standard that we heard in the Michael Shermer, Jordan Peterson video. The more I hear this thing, the more ridiculous it sounds. And you can find a write-up on it from the Rational Wiki. You hear it all the time in YouTube debates about apologetics. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, aka the Sagan standard, was a phrase made popular by Carl Sagan. Its roots are much older, however, with the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace stating that the more extraordinary a fact, the more it needs. Well, there's a funny value-laden word. The more that fact needs something. Who needs? What needs? Why needs? Where's the standard? Needs for what? Needs to be supported by strong evidence. Also, David Hume wrote in 1748, "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, and no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact that it endeavors to establish." Wow, that's quite something. And Marcelo Truzzi says an extraordinary claim requires. Who's doing this requiring? And for what? And how? And how does that work? Extraordinary proof. Either ways, the phrase is central to the scientific method. As I cover one eye, some of you will understand why. And a key issue for critical thinking, rational thought, and skepticism everywhere. The evidence puts forth in proponents of such things as gods, ghosts, paranormal, UFOs are highly questionable at best and offer little way of proof. Okay, well, we should talk about this because I think this is ridiculous. And I think this, frankly, they offer no proof for this claim, and it's certainly not holding, at least within the manifest image, or by human beings. And this is how human beings should live. Okay, my dog should speak English. Say that all you want. I don't think it's going to happen. So we're going to talk about a C.S. Lewis objection. We're going to notice that people don't believe things in like the resurrection in this way. And we're going to talk about, as I did in my 3-hour commentary on the unbelievable episode with Tom Holland, narrative maps and data, pre-evaluation for what an extraordinary event is, extraordinary event of winning the lottery, and why miracles don't convince in the way that rationalists imagine they do. As I said before, this came up with the Michael Shermer, Jordan Peterson conversation, and it reliably comes up. The standard defense against believing in the miraculous, as you can see. Really, what this is a game of social pressure and status. This is a sort of primate status monkey game where we're going to shame you because all the cool kids have this rule that we pretend we know how it works. And so if you don't abide by this rule, then you're not rational. Then you're foolish. Then you're not part of the cool rational kid club. Well, you know what? I don't think anybody's a member of that club. I don't think any of us actually use this rule to process anything in terms of events in the real world around us. It's simply not how people work. And we know this. We know it by cognitive science, and we should know it by common sense. Let's begin. We'll begin with C.S. Lewis. Ever since Hume's famous essay, it has been believed that historical statements about miracles are the most intrinsically improbable of all historical statements. According to Hume, now notice that Julius Caesar didn't believe this. Almost nobody in the ancient world believed this, but this is a rather late comer to humanity. According to Hume, probability rests on what may be called the majority vote of our past experiences. Well, we have laws of physics. We might as well have voting about experiences. The most often a thing has been known to happen, the more probable it is that it should happen again. And the less often the less probable. Now, the regularity of nature's course, says Hume, is supported by something better than the majority vote of past experiences. It's supported by their unanimous vote. I'm not sure when this vote was taken. Or, as Hume says, by firm and unalterable experience. Oh, so you've experienced that nature is uniformly a certain way, and now we must too. There is, in fact, uniform experience against miracles. Now, some of you know where I'm going to go with this mapping thing. That uniform experience is, of course, your map. That's what you're attesting to, right? You've never seen a fish that can fly, so therefore, fish can't fly. There is, in fact, uniform experience against miracles. Otherwise, says Hume, it would not be a miracle. A miracle is therefore the most improbable of all events, and it is always more probable that the witnesses were lying or mistaken than that a miracle occurred. Now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolute uniform experience against miracles, if, in other words, they have never happened, why then they never have. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. There is also an objection to Hume which leads us deeper into our problem. The whole idea of probability, as Hume understands it, depends on the principle of uniformity in nature. Unless nature always goes in the same way, the fact that a thing happened 10 million times would not make it a whit more probable that it would happen again. And how do we know the uniformity of nature? A moment's thought shows we do not know it by experience. We observe many regularities in nature, but of course all the observations that men have made or will make while the race lasts cover only a minute fraction of the events that actually go on. Our observations would therefore be of no use unless we felt sure that nature, when we are not watching, behaves in the same way as when we are. In other words, unless we believed in the uniformity of nature. Experience therefore cannot prove uniformity, because uniformity has to be assumed before experience proves anything. And mere length of experience does not help matters. It's no good saying each fresh experience confirms our belief in uniformity, and therefore we reasonably expect that it will always be confirmed. For that argument works only on the assumption that the future will resemble the past, which is simply the assumption of uniformity under a new name. Can we say that uniformity is at any rate very probable? Unfortunately not. We have just seen that all probabilities depend on it. Unless nature is uniform, nothing is either probable or improbable. And clearly the assumption which you have to make before there is any such thing as probability cannot itself be probable. The odd thing is that no man knew this better than Hume. His essay on miracles is quite inconsistent with the more radical, honorable, and skepticism of his main work. The question, do miracles occur, and the question, is the course of nature absolutely uniform, are the same question asked in two different ways. Hume, by sleight of hand, treats them as two different questions. He first answers yes to the question whether nature is absolutely uniform, and then uses this yes as the grounding for answering no to the question, do miracles occur? The single real question which he has set out to answer is never discussed at all. He gets the answer to one form of the question by assuming the answer to another form of the question. So there's a philosophical take on it, but I doubt most of you will find that terribly convincing. Why? Because our beliefs are not formed this way. Our beliefs are formed in an entirely different way. Whatever it is Hume and the skeptics are talking about in terms of probability and nature is not in any way the way any of us relate to beliefs about events in our normal life. It simply does not make a difference to us. Again, we're sort of asking our dogs to speak English. Ask all you want. It doesn't make sense. How are our beliefs formed, you asked? Well, I talked about this quite a bit in my 3-hour commentary, but maybe you don't want to watch that much. I get it. It's a lot. We begin mapping our world before we are born. Values, biases all start to rush in. We prefer the sound of our mom, the sound of our dad, the sound of the people that are connected with nice, cozy, warm experiences. The values start to bubble up and they get built and our mapping begins. Now, this, in fact, was a big piece of the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, and philosophically speaking, it didn't go very far. And ironically, Bret Weinstein is there, and the two people that should have been in most agreement, and they were quite often, were Jordan Peterson and Bret Weinstein. Jordan Peterson making the case that biologically, this stuff has been built into us for many successive generations before us. Not only biologically, genetically, but, and this is part of Bret Weinstein's big argument, also culturally. These mappings, in fact, when we come into the world, we begin to absorb not only our parents' map, but the maps that our parents' maps are nested within, all within an enormous community. And we do this automatically. This is what human beings do at a rate and to a degree far greater than any other creature we know. Your personal map is created by your parents' map, which is connected to the cultural map. Soon you'll be mapping from your peers and mapping from the television and mapping from the videos and mapping from all sorts of things. Part of what we've done in this human-produced world that right now a majority of us are growing up into is we're not mapping so much from sort of the reliability and predictability of a natural environment. We're just mapping people, and all these cultural products on us all the time. And even conflicts get mapped on us, and we learn to fight in certain ways. And so therefore, this argument by David Hume just gets trotted out, and everybody's supposed to go, oh yeah, I don't want to lose status and appear irrational. There's something rational about your mapping, but it's not that you believe on the basis of rationality or evidence or doing sophisticated mappings of probability. So here's the tricky part. So you develop this map, and as Jordan Peterson was arguing, all of the new data that comes in, that map is on one hand a first draft, a map, but it's also a filter. And so you can't take the data in an unbiased way. There's relevance realization, there's preference, there's bias. In fact, you are looking out into the world to reinforce your map, but some of the data is a little dissonant. And so you're also recalibrating your map, as are the other nested maps culturally that you are living in the midst of. If the data doesn't fit and can be discarded, it's usually just thrown away. If the data can't be discarded and it only requires slight alterations of the mapping through time, that's acceptable, but a little too much and you trigger trauma. You're sitting in your living room. Your spouse went out to buy some groceries. You hear sirens. You get a little anxious. A police car comes to your front door. Someone gets out with a windbreaker that says chaplain. Bang. Data is now coming in a very strange way. Abuse, trauma, shock. We've got a filter for this data. And, well, it's a good thing that we have these other more dramatic algorithms built into us because they protect us. And then you're going to spend a great deal of money on therapists dealing with your trauma, in all likelihood, decades later. Or you might just drink. You and your trusted cultural group keep calibrating all the maps via the data. And so, as I mentioned in that video, part of what we're experiencing now as a culture is, well, I just can't watch this particular news outlet because all I see is narrative. Right. Did you think that just having narrative-based news is new? No. You just have a diversity pluralism, a variety of news sources available to you, all with their own narratives. And, well, then the game begins, doesn't it? So those protesters storming the Capitol were fixing the election or straightening the election. It all depends on the narrative, right? And then the other side is like, why can't they see the truth? Well, because they're seeing the truth through their narrative, as are you. Now, this begins to feel unnerving, but it's really hard to break out of because, well, communities offer incentives and rewards with status and other perks. All you have to do is say David Hume and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There's the narrative. Oh, that's how I judge the world. Really? Why am I skeptical? Well, it's that disputed narrative that you hold. Okay. Now, this whole extraordinary claims require is just another version of the monarchical vision. Well, somehow there's this justification mechanism that is saying these are justifiable and these are not. And this is all sort of built into what? Your monarchical vision? Where's the council that decides? In many ways, the decision is made deep inside of you, bypassing your consciousness Congress, and in your community with its collective unconscious and its collective consciousness cultural congresses. It's all happening, and the story outside must match the story inside. And now this is enormously complex, and there's lots of dissonance around, but for the most part, you manage it because you're managing your equilibrium. People's maps vary. But now, did Caesar really cross the Rubicon? Well, yes. Well, where's that extraordinary evidence? Well, here's where that whole extraordinary evidence thing comes out. Did you expect Caesar was never going to cross the Rubicon again? Did you expect his soldiers in Gaul were never going to return to Rome? Well, and when we say Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and it is meaningful, what goes into that? You see, Caesar was going to cross the Rubicon, but it's all of the situations around it. It's all of the mappings that meant his crossing the Rubicon. And, Jordan Peterson, well, there's a bridge, there's a river, archetypes, all of this stuff. All of that goes into making Caesar cross, the Rubicon meaningful in a particular way. Caesar was going to cross the Rubicon at some point, but all of the mappings at that moment made that event extraordinary. Well, is it extraordinary like a miracle? Well, I would imagine everyone who heard news that Caesar has crossed the Rubicon found it extraordinary, or maybe not. They certainly found it relevant. And they certainly found it special and important. And today, nobody doubts that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Why? Oh, because it's an extraordinary event and it requires extraordinary evidence for me to believe it. Nobody's making that claim. Is it miraculous? Well, it's a miracle. Now, the meaning is fully dependent on a host of complex relational realities and mappings. What sort of evidence would be required to believe this? Is the nature of that evidence extraordinary? Say no. You can see that he crossed the Rubicon with your own eyes. You can, I can. It's thousands of years ago. You can't, I can't. None of us doubt it. Well, where are the eyewitnesses? We must have eyewitness testimony. Well, I'm sure they were available then because history played out the way it does. Now, it's important to understand what I'm arguing for and what I'm not. Let's have another example. Winning the lottery. Apparently, the odds of winning in California, the Mega Millions lottery, is about 1 in 58.9 million. Now, I would imagine me winning the lottery would be an extraordinary event. what kind of extraordinary evidence would be required for me to justifiably believe it? I suspect if you use this sort of thing, I could win the lottery and someone would say, Paul, you won the lottery. You have not provided me extraordinary evidence that I have. What do I require? A truck full of money dumped in my front yard? If they did that, I'd be pretty angry. Why? I'd like the money in my bank account, please, not dumped on my front yard for the wind to blow and my neighbors to filch. Does this make any sense? Extraordinary evidence. Because the evidence of me winning the most extraordinary event of winning the lottery would be, in fact, be very ordinary. Be me comparing my ticket to a number on a website. That's very ordinary for an extraordinary event. This whole idea makes no sense. According to Hume, no one reasonably would imagine they'd won the big prize unless some extraordinary evidence would show up. No, it's very ordinary evidence. It's very matter of fact. You see, this argument is not about people and belief at all, because people just don't believe this way. People simply don't believe common events in history in this way at all. In fact, events, we never stopped and thought about what that word meant. Events are all dependent upon narrative map-making dynamic. Please tell me what an event is. Events, in fact, are subject to relevance realization. Because, as I said, Caesar would have crossed the Rubicon eventually. He had crossed it before. He would cross it again. But still, thousands of years later, we talk about Caesar crossing the Rubicon or Constantine crossing the Milvian Bridge. It was all relevance realization that made that event and made that event either ordinary or extraordinarily by virtue of all the mappings that went on. In fact, it's only later when we imagine all sorts of chains of events do we find some things to be extraordinary, because extraordinary is a value judgment. It's a part of the manifest image. It's not a part of the scientific image. There are no extraordinary events in science. They're just events. That's all. It's the manifest image that makes them extraordinary. It's all of the mapping. And in fact, the evidence with respect to all of these events, it's all ordinary. Jesus multiplies loaves and fishes. Well, it's people looking at loaves and fishes just like they do every day. Jesus stills a storm. It's fishermen looking at the Sea of Galilee like they do every day. In fact, this entire argument is based on a very simplistic view of the world that has absolutely no relation to either. It doesn't take any account of human beings looking at the world, even though that's what the argument is about. It makes no sense. And if you've followed my Sunday sermons, you know this doesn't even work in the Bible this way. What do I mean? Well, Peter, James, and John see Jesus still the storm, see Jesus multiply loaves and fishes, see Jesus transfigured, and Peter himself says, let's build booths. And then when Jesus is arrested, well, shouldn't Peter say, well, Jesus is certainly the Son of God, and everything that happens now will go according to what he said would happen. And so, well, if he was paying attention, instead of simply filtering out what the Gospels say that Jesus said, by the way, I'm going to rise from the dead. None of them believed that. Why? They had a narrative. It got filtered out. And so they don't show up Sunday morning. And in fact, when Jesus is arrested, Peter loses his stuff in front of a slave girl sitting by a fire. No amount of miracle seemed to change Peter. Events don't work this way. Why? All of those miracles, if you believe they happened, filtered in and were interpreted by their narrative. And so Jesus' arrest and execution wasn't in their narrative, so they didn't know what to do it with the data, and so they went into trauma and stayed in an upper room sucking their thumbs. And it was only when Jesus would sort of coax them out that their map would slowly change. And that slow changing of that mapping went out into the world and has been changing the world ever since. By dominion. Read it. The story has been changing the world. It just has. Now, do you believe the story physically? Well, Tom Holland's got his doubts about the physicality of the story, yet he wrote the book about how the story itself has changed the world. The story of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon changed the world. The story of Constantine and the battle at Milvian Bridge changed the world. The story of what happened on January 6th, Epiphany of all days, 2021, changed the world. And a whole lot of other events that none of us are paying any attention to are changing the world as we speak. This entire argument imagines that people are something and can do something we are not and can't do. It simply makes no sense. Then you have the fun story of Paul at Lystra. In Lystra, there was a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed. We're really not quite sure what that means. And called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. Now, the whole reason this story is remembered has nothing to do with how miracles are supposed to work, supposedly for the rigged version of this book that we're reading, because it all goes terribly wrong. When a crowd saw that Paul had done, they shouted in Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Well, that's kind of a reasonable thing. They had a narrative, and the data fit the narrative. It's not the data that Luke or Paul or any of the Christians wanted. What did they want? Well, why did Paul heal him? Paul healed him out of mercy. That was it. Barnabas, they called Zeus. And Paul, they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And, well, you might say, well, isn't Paul greater than Barnabas? And so shouldn't Paul be Zeus and Barnabas Hermes? But you don't understand. This is what we do with people. We substitute because the gods have come down in human form. It's not incarnation like Christians say. It's just they show up, and because that's the kinds of things gods do. That's their narrative. Here are the events they're putting together. The people in the town just basically come to the conclusion that they would come to. The priests of Zeus, the ones who should know, I suppose. Do you have your little Zeus blood test? The priests of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bowls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. In other words, the world's most powerful sermon illustration gone terribly wrong. Instead of Paul somehow bringing them into the Christian faith, he sort of reinforced their belief in Zeus and Hermes with a miracle. That's the story in the book. Now, you might not believe it, but why on earth would they make up a story like this? Evidence. Extraordinary evidence. I can't make you believe because you've got a narrative, and this is data, and that's how we work. Slowly, surely, they do change. And when our narrative change, we call it conversion. Now, this is why most rationalist debates mean very little. They don't go anywhere, or they kind of do, because it's a little bit of data, and if it's just close enough to the narrative, then the narrative gets recalibrated. But for the most part, It's things a lot different from these little rational tidbits that actually change people's minds. And people have known this for a very long time. It's all been suppressed publicly because we're playing a status game about rationality. The funny thing is, we look at another side, either of a religious debate or a political debate, and we say, "Oh no," and then we play this whole rationality game, and it goes nowhere. And in fact, it makes things worse because we believe those who think different from us are stupid, when in fact they've got a different narrative. And in fact, if you want to engage them productively to win them towards your narrative, which is what all human beings do. This is part of the whole process by which we're always checking our narratives. Well, why don't you keep the data a little closer to where their narrative is and be a little gentle in terms of disturbing their equilibrium and maybe a little bit more loving, because we're really trying to figure out, well, coherence and plausibility. And in a lot of ways, as we always note in our enemies, but seldom note in ourselves, well, your narratives are motivated. Motivated by what? Motivated by self-interest, motivated by pride, motivated by status, all of those things. Now, I'm not saying human beings can't figure out truthful things. I'm just saying we're looking in the wrong place. And Hume's argument, Carl Sagan's argument, it's a diversion. It's a distraction. It's not how we really are. And I think that's the rational observation. Maps and data change slowly. The data map dynamic is slow and goes back and forth. If you want to change people's minds, and you do, create a community. People believe in community. You say, you only believe because you're part of a community that believes that. Uh-huh. That's how people believe. The more enduring the community, the more plausible the belief structure. But it's all got to work. Now, working is tricky too. And so my video on deconstruction, well, people are having dissonance. People are changing their narratives. And they're changing their narratives because of data. But it's all nested within all of these maps, which makes it really rather complicated to sort of pick it apart, because that's sort of how human beings are. Because it has to work through time, and it has to scale broadly in community. And when conditions change, mappings change. And mappings change too quickly, you can in fact lose the community. And so this is part of the reason you have the Lindy effect, as Nassim Taleb talks about, where, well, really long-standing things are battle-tested. This is sort of the idea between Jordan Peterson, pragmatic truth, and Darwinian truth. Battle-tested things are endured. And to the degree that you have choice in your narrative, and as you're selecting your data, well, some of these priorities we might want to keep in mind. It's true in politics too, of course. Money, climate, you name it, all of these dynamics are happening. And so, yeah, when people argue this with me, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Not with human beings. You can't even tell me what evidence or facts are. Let me know what you think in the comments.